Summer has come to an end, at least in the world of Formula One. While the teams, drivers and workshops are all back hard at work, the sport has arrived, curiously, on the beach. But this beach is the beach at Zandvoort, and that means it's time for the Dutch Grand Prix. But let's take a look at the season so far, because it's really interesting to see how the different teams have introduced components to their cars so far and how well those development projects have worked, because in some cases they haven't worked at all. But let's take a look at the data. So the white dots, as you see, is the gap to Red Bull as it sits at the moment going into the Dutch Grand Prix. Red Bull, of course, has no gap to Red Bull. They already are Red Bull, so you can't have a gap to yourself. However, the green dots are where teams started the season. And as you can see quite clearly, some teams haven't gone the right direction in terms of that gap to Red Bull, whereas others massively have. So before we take a look at some of the details that have resulted in this data, I think we should take a look at the car that everybody's aspiring to chase, the Red Bull RB19. Now, this is a car that it's kind of astonishing actually that we're talking about saying, is this car going to be unbeatable? Can they win every single Grand Prix in a single season? A feat no team has ever achieved. Well, Red Bull are looking like they may just about do it, but there's a few races to go and they're not going to have an easy time of it for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But Red Bull have been doing quite a lot of upgrades on their car, despite the fact they've got some pretty stringent aerodynamic testing restrictions as a result of winning last year's World Championship, and of course as a result of that penalty for breaching the cost cap. And a lot of those Red Bull upgrades have been focused around the side pods, taking advantage of that wind tunnel testing freedom for developing internal cooling systems. Quite a clever little bit of work there by Red Bull, and something I think you see a few other teams doing up and down the pit lane as well. So you see the side pod ducting they started the season with, then they went to a slightly narrower version later into the season, and then at the Hungarian Grand Prix, of course, going into that really tiny, almost letterbox style slit side pod. Just a hint of the sheer volume of upgrades that are going on the RB19 as they strive to stay ahead of that chasing pack. Now, one car in that chasing pack that probably has got Red Bull more worried than anybody expected at the start of the season is, of course, McLaren. Now, look at the rate of development through Team Papaya. The engineers in Woking have gained over a second to Red Bull and are getting ever closer. A huge improvement on a car that started the season looking pretty terrible, actually, and they've seriously improved it. Well, one of the reasons McLaren looks so good and have found such a big advantage is I think they've just got the car concept right. Now take a look at the Red Bull. This is the RB19 going through a corner, and you can see a few distinctive design features here. Note the pull rod, front suspension, the suspension angle as well, the geometry of the front suspension, the shape of the front wing, the shape of the nose as well. These are all components that give a hint towards the car's overall concept. Well, when you take a look at the McLaren, a lot of those details seem almost identical. You've got the rough same suspension geometries, you've got the same pull rod front suspension, the general front wing shape, the general nose shape as well is pretty similar. I mean, it's not conclusive, but when you start looking at the cars as they drive around the track, you realise with development, the McLaren is looking more and more like an orange Red Bull. The two cars are following the same conceptual path, and they're the only two cars in the field that are following that route. So I think McLaren could actually end up scoring some big results later in this year as they continue to unlock performance on those two cars. And that's something that could have Red Bull a little bit worried. At the start of the season, though, it was Ferrari that everybody expected to be taking the fight to Red Bull. But if you have a look at Ferrari's development rate, it's going in the wrong direction. They're getting worse. They're getting further away from Red Bull's overall pace, and that's not something any team wants to see. Ferrari introduced an absolutely enormous technical upgrade at the Spanish Grand Prix, and it does seem to have worked in some ways, but not as well as anybody expected, moving away from that very distinctive dished side pod shape, which started a whole wave of imitators throughout the 2022 and now the 2023 seasons. Ferrari've got some power unit reliability issues. We've seen that all year long. They also absolutely munch through their tyres. So whatever performance they put on the car, it doesn't really matter. If you can't make the tyres last, your race strategy is going to be a disaster. So Ferrari need to get a handle on that problem. They know about it, but they've yet to solve it. So that's going to be their focus for the latter part of the season. If they crack that, could they start turning around this trend and moving forwards? Because if they don't, they're going to have to be watching their backs, because the team that is second in the Constructors' Championship now are Mercedes, a car that everybody deemed as being absolutely terrible at the start of the season. Well, look, it's beginning to improve. Not massively, and it's still behind McLaren, it's behind Ferrari, but they're closing up on the Red Bulls. And the Mercedes does seem to be starting to work the way the team sort of wanted, but that's only after some pretty drastic changes. Check out the side pod changes. We've talked a huge amount about this all season already, going from the no side pod concept or the zero pod concept to a far more conventional design, which has then been modified as the season has gone on. It's beginning to work quite well for Mercedes, but they're still not quite where they wanted to be. Massive front suspension changes on that car as well. Mirror changes, lots of detail changes coming from Mercedes. They are beginning to improve. The drivers are still not happy with that car, but it does suggest that Mercedes are going to be a bit more of a force later this year and certainly into 2024. Unhappy drivers, though, that's a little bit of a story down in the French camp, or is it the Enstone camp? That's in England, but nonetheless, the Alpine team, they've had lots of interesting detailed design changes to the car, and the Alpine car itself does seem to have quite a lot of pace. It's very good in straight lines and could be very good at Monza. But one of the problems that Alpine have faced all year long are driver-led engineering design changes, as I sometimes call them, or when the drivers write off the cars, as happened at the Australian Grand Prix in spectacular fashion, costing the team a huge amount of points. But it's not just the drivers that are causing car failures. The car itself has really poor reliability and has been blowing up rather too much. Had it not been that sort of performance, I think we would have seen Alpine higher up this data, because the team would have been able to develop the car a bit more. But the development of the car hasn't been too bad. They have been improving. Unlike the team that everybody was talking about in the opening races of the season. I talk, of course, about Aston Martin. Aston Martin started the season brilliantly. Everybody thought it was a hype train. But in fact, the green team has gone backwards as the season has progressed. They are really struggling to get the most out of the car. And the team have accepted they've taken some wrong engineering directions. Well, the overall concept of the car is a good one. Those deep dish side pods have inspired so many copies up and down the field. And there's lots of beautiful engineering details on these Aston Martins. And those engineering details are still coming here at the Dutch Grand Prix. They've introduced new rear brake ducts, changed the winglets around this section of the car. And of course, the one design change that everybody is talking about up and down the pit lane, that tiny little winglet underneath the rear crash structure. Just getting the car into the pits without breaking those new parts off it has already proved to be a bit of a challenge for the Aston Martin team. But are we going to see copycats up and down the field? Absolutely, we are. Another Mercedes-powered team that we've all been talking about this season, particularly in the mid-season area, is a team that nobody really expected much from at the start of the year. It is, of course, the Williams team. Now, Williams very much built a car with very good top speed, and that's really helped them out because they've then engineered in some downforce as the season has developed. And look, the gap has slowly closed to Red Bull. Now, in the right track conditions, Williams really can take the fight to the front of the field. We saw that in qualifying and practice around the Belgian Grand Prix, but the weather conditions at Spa meant that Williams couldn't really show what they could do. Monza could be a very different story for the former world champions. And one of the biggest changes that they made to their car was going from their early side pod solution, which to this more conventional side pod solution that we saw first for Alex Albon and then later for Logan Sargent, who's had to continue running the older original side pod solution. Now that's a solution that looks, if you think, rather familiar, particularly from this angle. Well, it's something that Williams introduced and then Ferrari sort of went the same route a little while later. So quite an interesting situation where Williams are leading the design trends over some bigger and more fancied teams. And Red Bull has actually admitted copying some of the floor features of the Williams car. So all those pictures of the car up on a crane at Monaco, people saying, oh, it looks really basic underneath the floor. it's a little bit deceptive. The Williams is actually quite an interesting car, and it's very, very fast in the right conditions. So don't write off the team from Grove near Wantage in Oxfordshire. Then the two Ferrari-powered customer teams, Haas and Alfa Romeo. The cars have some obvious similarities. They both use Ferrari power units and some Ferrari components underneath the bodywork. Well, the Haas in particular has very much followed the Ferrari design concept. You've got those deeply dished side pods that the Ferrari started the season with. You've got some of the details around the rear wing, some of the details around the front wing, particularly the famous sticky uppy bits along the upper two elements. That's something that Haas have had, Ferrari have had all season long. Mercedes, who introduced them, seems to have given up on the concept, but it doesn't really matter. The Haas also, unfortunately, seems to have copied one of Ferrari's traits, and that's eating its tyres alive. The Haas can qualify very, very well indeed, but it doesn't seem to be able to race well. And that's where you look in the performance characteristics here. Even with a number of upgrades coming onto the Haas, its improvement just isn't really great. It's kind of stayed still since the start of the season. As Red Bull have improved, Haas has improved at an almost identical rate, i.e. not a huge amount relative to Red Bull. However, the Alfa Romeo, on the other hand, has improved hugely as the season has progressed. You might not see it out on track in terms of car performance and outright lap time, but the Alfa Romeo is actually a more interesting car because this is the first car for a long time where the Sauber engineering, the Sauber motorsport team in Switzerland, have developed their own transmission at the rear of the car. So there's a lot of learning going on for this team before it sort of transforms itself into Audi Sports Formula One team in 2026. And I think that's going to change this team a lot. So a lot of a learning process for this Ferrari-powered Alfa Romeo at the moment, but that's all learning for future. So don't write this team off yet. They are developing well. Finally, one team that isn't developing brilliantly and has actually gone backwards during the season is AlphaTauri. Now, the Italian-based Red Bull-owned team were expected to be a bit better in terms of performance all year long. However, there have been some lovely engineering details on the car, such as this rear wing design, which we talked about quite extensively in some of the live coverage, where you see that side element's been cut out. But everyone says the biggest upgrade to the car, unfortunately, is its drivers. Well, with the Dutch Grand Prix coming up, there's still 10 races to go and a huge amount more to play for. Stable regulations into next season as well means that the teams can keep developing right up to the end of the season. So who will be able to catch Red Bull and the seemingly unbeatable Red Bull RB19? Well, who knows? But I think it's going to be very, very interesting watching all of those teams trying to shut the door on the world champions.